Well, hello, everyone, and welcome. The Colonial Society of Massachusetts welcomes you to this evening's lecture. I am Bob Allison. I am president of the Colonial Society. We are a scholarly organization which publishes primary documents and also hosts meetings like this and also supports younger scholars with an annual graduate student forum. And I'm glad you found us. And our guest tonight is James Fichter, and Professor Fichter is an associate professor of European and American Studies and the program director of European Studies at Hong Kong University. He's in the School of Modern Languages and Cultures. He has his first book, So Great a Prophet, was about how the East Indies transformed Anglo-American capitalism. He's written a number of essays on the maritime world. He teaches courses on maritime history, the Revolutionary Atlantic, and the First World War. He has a book project in the works on the Suez Passage to India and Britain, France, and the Great Game at Sea. But he's here to talk to us tonight about his most recent book, Tea, Consumption, Politics, and Revolution, 1773, 1776. So please welcome James Fichter.
Well, thank you very much, Bob, and allow me to thank all the members of the Colonial Society for this opportunity to speak with you this evening. I'm only sorry I can't be in person, but it's a pleasure to be able to join you online. So today, I'm going to talk about the Boston Tea Party, and I have a larger set of slides to share, so I'm just going to share that now and set that up. Right.
We're seeing the whole thing, so you might want to change it so we're just seeing the slide. There we go. Perfect.
Yeah. So so I'm going to talk to you about the Boston Tea Party, but I want to say, well, I'll be talking about more than just the Tea Party itself. So I'm going to also, I think you guys are probably seeing all that, so I'll just move this up here. So the Boston Tea Party is well known to most Americans for its centrality in and for sparking the American Revolution. But its place in the American creation myth that we know, or we think we know, is largely false. What we think of as the Boston Tea Party can in important ways be wrong. Now, don't worry, it is true that on the evening of December 16th, 1773, British colonists destroyed 3 cargoes of tea weighing about 90,000 pounds by tossing these cargoes into Boston Harbor. But what did that act constitute? Why did British colonists in New England do it? What did it all mean? What did they mean by it? How did the destruction of tea affect events going forward? The Tea Party did not miraculously or automatically make America. And so the answer to these questions is much more complicated than we've often imagined. One way we misunderstand the Tea Party is to imagine it as a one-off major event. It was a one-off major event, but that was only the result of complicated and difficult wrangling on the part of patriots. In fact, it is likely intended by Patriot leaders at the time and was certainly understood by Governor Hutchinson and others after as responding to the specific problems posed by what political scientists and game theorists would call a repeated game. The Dartmouth, the first of the several vessels which brought tea to Boston Harbor in December of 1773, reached Boston with its cargo of East India Company tea late in the evening on November 27th, 1773. There was a 20-day deadline to land dutiable cargo, which meant that were the tea not landed and the duty not paid by the end of December 16th, then on the 17th, customs officers would seize and land the cargo for themselves, aided by the king's troops if needed. This cargo would then have been impounded until the duty was paid for and potentially auctioned off to raise the duty revenue. Both sides were aware of this deadline, and both sides operated accordingly. One reason for either side not to give in was the staggered arrival dates, however, of the 4 tea ships coming to Boston. Boston was notable, for while the East India Company sent tea to 4 different cities in North America in the autumn of 1773, to Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston, South Carolina, only in Boston were these cargoes staggered over multiple vessels, arriving over a week or two. So, the Dartmouth had arrived first, but 3 other tea vessels were sailing behind her, and the outcome of the conflict over the Dartmouth would affect how British colonists dealt with the following vessel, the Eleanor, which had arrived on December 2nd. As I've indicated here, were nothing to happen, were the Eleanor's tea not to be destroyed, that cargo would itself be impounded on December 22. So if customs officers safely impounded the tea from the Dartmouth, it would be harder for radicals to oppose the same measure for the Eleanor. Any principled or practical barrier that the Patriots had had to landing the tea from the Eleanor would have to have already been pierced in landing the tea from the Dartmouth. Likewise, if Patriots succeeded in pressuring customs officers to send the tea on the Dartmouth back to England, whatever problems that had been would be presented on doing the same with the Eleanor, such as violating navigation law or customs regulations, would already have to have been overcome with the Dartmouth. If Patriots or customs officers could compromise on the first vessel, they could compromise on the next. This locked each side into another kind of game, a game of chicken, with, by early December, each seeing the Eleanor at the wharf next to the Dartmouth, and knowing that whatever happened to the one would establish a precedent for the other. Now, it's worth noting here that the 2 options I've laid out, the option of sending the tea vessel back to England with the tea intact, or allowing the tea to be impounded by customs officers, were the 2 options that Patriots and customs officials across the rest of North America came around to accepting with regard to the other tea ships in the other 3 cities. Indeed, returning, not destroying, the tea was even admitted by the Boston Committee to be the preferred outcome. Yet, while in every other city, Patriots and port authorities came to a negotiated settlement agreeing either to return the vessels, as in New York and Philadelphia, or allow it to be the tea to be impounded, as in Charleston, only in Boston did both sides fail to yield. And so the Boston Tea Party happened on December 16th, 1773. Now, as I've explained, the tea was sent to a variety of cities, not just to Boston. And you can see here that that's annoying. Okay, you can see here that the Dartmouth, Eleanor, and Beaver bring about 92,000 pounds of tea. This is the tea that's destroyed to Boston. But over 200,000 pounds of tea is brought to New York, and another 200,000 plus to Philadelphia. These cargoes add up to the vast majority of the tea sent by the company to North America. So one thing to take away from this is simply that while the tea that was destroyed in Boston Harbor was significant and important, politically vital, it wasn't representative of what colonists did elsewhere. So, Paul Revere arrived on December 27th, or 24th rather, with the Boston Committee of Correspondence's account of the destruction of the tea in Boston. This account was written on December 17th and carried by Revere as writer to New York and Philadelphia, and seems to have served as the main source of news about the Tea Party for as far south as South Carolina. In this text, the Boston Committee says several things. First, it lays out the proposition that they had no idea what was going on with the tea. It's notable that there's a careful distancing here that goes on. I've taken the original letter here portrayed on the left, and I've excerpted exerted some of the more useful text on the right and underlined parts that you might find especially useful. So as the Boston Committee explained, every step that was taken to try to return the tea, only when they failed to do that did they proceed to the next step. And indeed, they did not proceed to this step, not in any official capacity. Rather, a number of people presumably and presumptively unknown, but of course known, huzzah'd in the street, and soon the tea was immersed in the bay. Not we immersed it, not certain people immersed it, just in the sublime use of the passive voice, it was immersed. The spirit of the people, not of us, on this occasion was quite high. This is, of course, an amusing legal fiction, common in many documents at the time, which allow patriots to talk about political events, which were also criminal acts, such as the Boston Tea Party. For the destruction of the tea in Boston was a riot and a crime. And now Boston patriots could talk about it and inform others about it without assuming legal responsibility for these actions on paper, which had the potential to be problematic, particularly to a movement well populated by lawyers. Paul Revere arrived in Philadelphia on December 24th with this account of the destruction of the tea in Boston. The next day, Christmas Day, the Polly arrived outside that city with the East India Company's consignment of tea for Pennsylvania. The captain left his vessel outside the customs area of the port and went up the Delaware River separately into Philadelphia. He was thoroughly impressed by the 8,000-strong gathering that assembled to oppose the tea. He resupplied the Polly for a quick return to England, and then quickly returned with the tea on board. This was a case of Philadelphia patriots having just been advised by the Boston Committee about the destruction of the tea in that city, carefully avoiding the same fate and outcome, which they deemed suboptimal, and finding a better solution for their own city. Nor was Philadelphia the only city to pursue an alternative tack. In South Carolina, the London had arrived on December 2nd. This event is of the arrival of the four different tea arrivals for the four different tea cities. The South Carolina story is by far the least well known, but is deeply important. And I've uncovered a lot of new information that helps us understand this story better. Upon the London's arrival, Christopher Gadsden and his Sons of Liberty put up flyers, and the next day a large gathering was held in the Great Hall of the Exchange. This building dominated the city and coast, and you can see it here in this slide. This is a painting from, I believe, around 1780, and the Exchange is the square or the rectangular blocky building in the center right of this Charleston skyline here. So the Exchange was a vital point in the city. And here in the Exchange, patriots assembled on December 3rd, resolving, and I quote, "We, the undersigned, hereby agree not to import, either directly or indirectly, any tea that will pay the present duty laid by an act of the British Parliament for the purpose of raising a revenue in America," unquote. All well and good, but not everyone signed the agreement. Not everyone that was at the meeting at the Exchange signed this agreement. And so the meeting proceeded forward. Next, it summoned three merchants, Roger Smith, Peter Legger, and William Greenwood, Jr. These three men were the East India Company's consignees. The consignees were men designated to receive and sell the company's tea on the company's behalf. The consignees faced, in their own words, a, quote, great majority, unquote, against landing the tea. But despite rumors to the contrary, they did not resign their position in handling the East India Company's tea. You should be careful when you see use of the word resign, referring to the consignees. Resignation was a complicated and nuanced thing. Often people might even say they would have nothing more to do with it, but not formally resign and perhaps have some soft role in the tea going forward anyway. While the consignees failed to resign, they did note the majority against the tea's landing. They also noted that the meeting decided, in their words, quote, to wink at every pound of tea smuggled in, unquote, so as not to actually run out of it. This created what the consignees thought was a glaring inconsistency. And as Legger and Greenwood reported back to London, quote, merchants in general have determined against, unquote, the meeting of the 3rd. The next day, a committee deputed by the meeting waited on the rest of the city's merchants, asking them to sign their budding non-importation agreement. According to Peter Timothy, editor of the highly patriotic South Carolina Gazette and a writer willing to shade the truth to suit his cause at times, quote, upwards of, unquote, 50 signed. I don't know what upwards of 50 people means. It might mean 49. It might mean 9, depending on how aggressively Timothy felt he wanted to round things. Some merchants, however, contrived to be absent when the committee called or put them off with requests for a little more time to think about the matter. Timothy never indicated exactly who signed, ultimately how many signed. We do not know whether the merchants who did ultimately sign this were influential, whether they were representative, whether they were well-financed, or, a question perhaps worth asking, whether they were even involved in the tea trade at all. Patriots soon realized how ineffective their initially seemingly effective efforts had been. On December 3rd, upstairs in the Great Hall of the Exchange, politicians and radicals had talked and argued, and they seemed to have carried their case. But while all of the patriot agitators and Sons of Liberty in the city were upstairs looking at each other across the room, downstairs on the ground floor, merchants landed private parcels of tea from the London and 2 other vessels that had arrived. They paid the duties at the customs house, which occupied the ground floor of the same building. The Great Hall of the Exchange had the customs house on the ground floor and the city's main meeting facility on the floor above. They paid the duties in the customs house right underneath the talking politicians and carted the containers, quote, right by the meeting of the people and their conveyance to their respective owners, unquote. Even Timothy had to admit that the merchants hadn't really stopped importing duty teas. Indeed, Charlestonians soon couldn't even agree what the meeting of December 3rd had even agreed upon. This is, of course, the great and time-tested way to muddy the waters in politics, to get people confused about what has previously been agreed. So a new general meeting was called for December 17th. That meeting did uphold the ban on the London's tea. But a curious thing happened. It didn't quite ban the sale of other dutied or smuggled tea, nor it simply postponed the date when such a sale would be banned. And this is an interesting point, because in late 1773, across many cities in North America, the price of tea had skyrocketed. It takes only a bit of simple reasoning to work out how and why this is happening. Merchants across North America, both importing smuggled tea from the Netherlands and dutied tea regularly imported from Britain, and not directly from the company, anticipated the company's tea shipments, which amounted to more than 600,000 pounds of tea. Anticipating this large supply to come, merchants cut back on their own orders because they expected a market glut. However, none of the East India Company's tea shipments actually reached market in late 1773, which meant there was a shortage, a price spike, and then a failure for the new supply to meet the unmet demand, which meant that prices stayed high. While I can document the increase in tea prices in other cities, especially and including Boston, it's unclear it happened in Charleston, although it's reasonable to conclude it probably did. Holding the company's tea off the market would keep tea prices high. However, merchants could only take advantage of these high prices and sell the other tea they had just landed from in early December if they abided by the Patriots' trade restrictions. As a sweetener, merchants were even allowed to import a little more. The South Carolina meeting resolved that tea ought not to be imported, but didn't set a clear date for when non-importation actually had to start, and final decision on the matter was put off until the following year. This meant that if merchants were well behaved and abided by Patriot trade restrictions on the company's tea, they could sell the other tea they had at hand, perhaps for a tidy profit. On December 22, customs collector Robert Halliday seized, landed, and stored the East India Company's tea sent to Charleston for non-payment of duty. In this job, he was assisted by the sheriff and his men. This was the major step that Massachusetts patriots tried to prevent by throwing Boston's tea shipments into the harbor. It took men in Charlestown, South Carolina, 5 hours from 7 in the morning until after noon to store the tea from the London in the northernmost cellar of the exchange, during which time, as Lieutenant Governor William Bull explained, quote, there was not the least disturbance, unquote. Gadsden, Sons of Liberty, sleepily explained that they were surprised this had happened so early in the morning. Well, so much for stopping the tea. Back to Boston. One of the Boston's consignees, the merchant Jonathan Clark, rode out to the castle to oversee salvage of the 4th tea ship, the William, which had wrecked off Cape Cod on December 11th. There were 4 ships. As I've said, there were 4 tea ships sent to Boston, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver. I last left this story with the Eleanor, which had arrived on December 2. The Beaver had arrived on December 7th, and it had a confirmed case of smallpox on board, and therefore it had a week-long quarantine. It only came to Griffin's Wharf on December 15th. This seemed to leave a narrow window to destroy the tea. Only after the Beaver had pulled up alongside the Eleanor and the Dartmouth could all 3 cargoes be dealt with altogether. News had already reached Bostonians on December 11th that the William, the 4th tea ship, had wrecked off Cape Cod. And so it might have seemed, briefly, that they were down from 4 tea ships to 3, and that all 3 tea ships were, for a brief moment, held together. This was certainly true on December 15th. However, also on December 15th, news reached Boston that the William had not been destroyed and that the cargo, most of the cargo from the vessel had been saved. And in fact, announcement of this news was soon published in the Massachusetts Gazette the following day, on December 16th. That means that on the very day of the Boston Tea Party, news was being published of the survival and salvage of this 4th cargo of tea. Boston patriots, therefore, likely knew they could not save all of the tea, rather knew they could not destroy all of the tea in Boston Harbor because 1 cargo was outside of their reach. The Williams. Notably, this presented a meaningful opportunity for the consignees in Boston to try to salvage this tea and to make some effort to sell it. Beyond that, it also provided further opportunities for the patriots to try to stop this tea. It's worth noting here too, before going on to the story of the Williams, several other points. It's commonly said in the story of the Boston Tea Party that the Tea Party was somehow paradoxically an act that was very respectful of property. Patriots commonly claim that they respected property, and of course it was pointed out, a story was made at the time and has been told since about the extent to which they took care not to destroy other cargoes on these vessels and even replaced a lock that had been damaged on one of the other crates. All well and good, but of course, the schedule I've laid out here indicates that if they really only meant to destroy the tea, which was going to be impounded, they only had to destroy the tea from the Dartmouth. They did not need to touch the tea from the Eleanor at all, which wasn't due to have its tea impounded for several more days, and the Beaver for several more days after that. But as I said at the beginning, this was obviously going to be a repeated game. If Patriots destroyed the tea on the Dartmouth, they had every reason to expect that the Eleanor that something else might happen to the Eleanor. Yes, perhaps the vessel might pull away from the wharf and try to go back to England. But just as likely, it wouldn't. Perhaps the king's troops would defend the vessel and prevent its tea from being destroyed. Given that patriots had posted a civilian guard on the wharf in order to prevent the tea's cargo from being landed, this presented the possibility of a Boston Massacre level confrontation between the two forces, something certainly worth avoiding. Therefore, patriots sought to destroy all 4 of the tea cargoes at once. They couldn't. They destroyed only 3. Then what they did was they began to carefully soft pedal the news of this 4th cargo. This is the Boston Committee of Correspondence's letter to Philadelphia, which I have shown you earlier. It's replaced here on the left. On the right, I've excerpted the postscript, which you can see in the bottom, but might be a bit of a scroll for you to look at closely. The postscript here is a careful phrasing, and it explains what happened to the tea from the William. They write, P.S. The other vessel was by the act of God cast on shore on the back of Cape Cod. This is an extremely vague phrasing. It is, of course, supposed to be news and provide new information, but there's actually no real new information in this postscript. It simply provides greater confusion and uncertainty. Was the vessel destroyed? Presumably. Was the cargo salvaged? Maybe. Did the crew survive? Who knows? It allows the reader to reach their own conclusion. The Boston Committee of Correspondence isn't lying to the Philadelphia Committee, or at least they're not overtly telling untruths. They're telling a lie of omission. They know what happened to the cargo. It has been salvaged. News of this has already appeared in the newspaper the previous day. But they're not mentioning that detail in their letter to Philadelphia, because, of course, that's a politically sensitive point. To say that the tea had been salvaged from the William, that its fate was uncertain, would potentially undermine support for resisting the tea in Philadelphia. And so Bostonians didn't lie. They simply obscured the truth. Well, one of the Boston consignees, Jonathan Clark, rowed out to the Cape to oversee salvage. He was the man who took the key decision to send the tea to Castle Island rather than to Boston proper, and he informed the other Boston consignees from Cape Cod of this on New Year's Eve. The castle was the obvious refuge point. There, the other consignees were already hiding, holed up to escape the anger of the Boston mob. On New Year's Day, January 1st, the consignees informed Boston's customs officers they would not dare bring the tea from the William to town or report it at the customs house, which was also located in town, because although this was legally required of them, it was, quote, utterly out of our power to receive and sell the said teas, unquote. This looks like a resignation of their duty in the tea, but as I've said, such resignations are often deceptive. In this case, it was a feint, as it allowed customs officers to deem it, quote, our duty to take possession of said tea, unquote, when the tea arrived on January 3rd, without having to wait the standard 20 days to seize it for non-payment of duty. How do we know this was a feint? Because throughout 1774, it was the consignees, not the customs officers, who corresponded with the company about the tea. So, customs officers counted 54 chests and 1 barrel of tea out of the original 58 chests sent. Deeming this tea, quote, unsafe in the king's store in town, unquote, and fearing the tea would be destroyed were to come to the harbor, customs officers looked for a way to secure it. Our story of the Tea Party often revolves around intransigence, the intransigence of government officials like Governor Hutchinson, customs officers, the intransigence of Admiral John Montagu, the intransigence of other state officers as they prevent patriots from finding some sort of creative way to send the Dartmouth, Eleanor, and Beaver's teas back to England. But actually here, customs officers and government officials are quite creative. They look and proactive as they look for a way to save and protect this last cargo of tea. they sensed the political significance of doing so. It's a question of their authority, their capacity to protect and secure things in their power and in their custody. And so customs officers asked Admiral John Montagu for protection, then Governor Hutchinson and Lieutenant Colonel Leslie. This last commanded the 64th Regiment, which was stationed at the castle. The castle offered the obvious and most secure point in the entire colony. The governor and the colonel agreed, coming to a jurisdictional compromise whereby the customs personnel got the key to the room in the castle where the tea was lodged, while the army guarded the castle and the Navy guarded the seas around it. I mentioned before that this was a repeated game, and the repeated game in this case is a game whereby, having seen the first 3 cargoes of tea destroyed, government officials realize that they need to be more proactive in finding a way to save the 4th cargo. And there it stayed in Castle William. Here is a drawing of the castle on Castle Island, protected by his Majesty's Army and Navy, and quote, in the custody of the officers of the customs for the security of the duty thereon, unquote, the very thing the Boston Tea Party was supposed to prevent. What does this mean? Well, the Tea Party, I think, had probably served as a message for patriots on the Cape to also destroy their tea. This was one reason to destroy the first 3 cargoes of tea in Boston Harbor, to tell Cape Codders to do the same. The Tea Party also had an alternative news value. News of the destruction of the tea drowned out news that some of the tea had survived. News accounts rarely mention the survival of the tea from the William. If they do, it's brief, and then that report quickly disappears. It is the destruction of the tea that dominates news coverage, that dominates discussion in the weeks and even months ahead. And yet, the Cape Codders did not destroy their tea. Many argued it was fine to use and drink the William's tea because it had been wrecked and therefore not properly landed and not officially paid any duties. Indeed, the salvage crews that had rescued the cargo, tea and otherwise, from the William had been paid in tea. Why shouldn't they enjoy their wages and the fruits of their labor? News of this tea's survival wasn't helpful, so the Boston Committee of Correspondence began to hide it. They went so far as to even mislead South Carolina patriots about this, chiding South Carolinians for allowing tea to be impounded by customs officers, the exact thing which had also happened in Boston. So, what was the Boston Tea Party? It was certainly a forceful rejection of parliamentary authority. That much is clearly true. But it was also a failure because it left some tea undestroyed. In the minds of many, it was also excessive. For example, John Adams, who liked it, thought the Tea Party was sublime, but even he worried a similar uprising could easily cost lives the next time a crowd event like that occurred. George Washington simply disapproved. So did Benjamin Franklin, who called the Tea Party, quote, an act of violent injustice, unquote. Patrick Henry and Richard Henry Lee did not approve either. Henry Laurens in South Carolina was not surprised that wily Cromwellians went to such extremes in Boston, and he preferred instead, however, Charleston's prudent approach. James Madison preferred Philadelphians for their discretion. Others, though, did approve, meaning that one product of the Tea Party was widespread division and rancor, not at all unanimous consent to a common cause. Now, this slide here is a illustration from spring 1774. This was created in Philadelphia, and it's a bit of a tricky map to quite get your head around. It's in fact showing 2 different images on the same in the same frame. So on the top part, you see an area labeled North America. In this section, it is a map in which west is up. So you can see there's a ship. It says from New York above the ship. And you can see, if you look above it, a lighthouse. In fact, what this is illustrating is the Delaware Bay to the left and the Hudson River and New York to the right. You can see Long Island marked there under the words America. So this is the American coastline, and this is showing the tea ships returning from it. There's a Philadelphia tea ship and a New York tea ship returning from it. The Philadelphia tea ship has largely made it back to England. In addition, on the far right of the image, you can see a hooked piece of land. That is Cape Cod. And so you have 3 vessels in Boston Harbor, and you have the William wrecked off Cape Cod. Notably, South Carolina's tea and the South Carolina story, which would be to the left and up from the far left corner of this map, is chopped off completely and not part of the story. A helpful propaganda point, and the survival of the Williams tea is not really illustrated either. The bottom frame shows something else, which is the bottom section of the frame shows something else. On the bottom right quadrant, you have colonists portrayed here either as Native Americans or as colonists. So simply, this becomes part of the artistic portrayal of colonists as natives. And you have them opposed to the figures on the bottom right, who are British government officials. One of them you can see being caressed and his ear whispered into by Satan. This image, though amusing, of course, one of the key things it portrays is a unified America in the bottom right, resisting a Britain in the bottom left. The key of what I'm trying to say here is how false this concept is. The idea of intercolonial unity, or simply within a colony unity in response to the Boston Tea Party, was false. And it is best to dispense with this notion, as Mary Beth Norton has also pointed out in her recent book, 1774. John Adams would justify the Tea Party in his own journal as a tax revolt. That is, he thought to let the tea be landed would be to give up the principle of taxation by parliamentary authority against which colonists had struggled so mightily for so long. But this was a delusion. The principle had long been given up. This chart here shows tea imported into North America by British colonists. It shows a 5-year section of time, and I've tried to condense the regions of North America into some smaller, more comprehensible list. You'll find Massachusetts, including Maine, indicated in bold here. Almost all of this tea from Massachusetts is imported to Boston. This data was created by British government officials by the new Customs Authority, which was located in Boston and created as part of the Townshend Acts in 1767. It got going in 1768, and it records a 5-year data set of legally imported duty tea arriving in North America. One response to the Townshend Acts was a boycott movement to boycott lead, paint, glass, tea in response to the Townshend Acts, something we all learned about in primary school. You can see Massachusetts' participation in this boycott in the bold line going across the center. If you look at the year 1770, you can see the Massachusetts tea import levels do indeed go down, although they do not go to zero, as the much more well-behaved colonists in New York and Philadelphia and Pennsylvania seem to have done, and they go back up to their previous levels the year after. All of this tea was not imported directly by the East India Company to North America, but imported privately, auctioned by the company in London, purchased by London-based merchants, and shipped to North American merchants privately and legally. Seeing these millions of pounds of tea being shipped to North America in the previous 5 years, millions of pounds of duty tea, and seeing well over 500,000 pounds of duty tea being sent to Massachusetts alone, the colony which received far more tea than any other colony in North America, far more duty tea than any other North American colony before the Boston Tea Party. It seems that destroying the tea was not about avoiding any sullying of the principle of taxation without representation. No, it was the last-ditch effort to prevent the total collapse of that principle, which was, as suggested by this chart, well onto its last legs. Bostonians had been losing on this front for years, and there was a real likelihood, as this data suggests, that were the East India Company's tea landed, it could have been sold, as the duty tea already charted on this chart was. This would have embarrassed Boston patriots, both to their comrades in other cities and, more broadly, it would simply have shown that Boston patriots didn't speak for everyone on matters of protest and boycott. So they destroyed the tea to prevent its consumption. It is wrong to think of the Boston Tea Party as a boycott. No, it prevented Bostonians from having a boycott because there was a risk that boycott might fail. Writers opposing the destruction of the tea pointed exactly this out. If colonists didn't like tea, they could just avoid it. As Virginia Attorney General and a very conservative man, John Randolph, noted, if a commodity, which is, quote, if a commodity which is not approved of be brought to market, no one will purchase it, unquote, leaving little to fear from the tea being landed if it were truly disapproved of. Excuse me. But as Robert Carter Nicholas asked in reply, quote, why should we expect a larger portion of public virtue amongst Bostonians, quote, than anywhere else? Many would have refrained from buying the tea, but others probably could not. I don't bring up this quote to insult or malign Bostonians, but merely to point out Nicholas's comment is to the effect that Bostonians are regular people, no more or less virtuous than anywhere else, and we cannot expect nor can we expect a uniformity of opinion in Boston on any political issue, any more or less than we could expect unanimity of opinion anywhere else. Therefore, Boston patriots had to destroy the tea because they could not trust other Bostonians to boycott it. Similarly, Massachusetts patriot James Otis worried New Englanders generally would refuse to what he called renounce tea, and the patriots would have to do the renouncing for them. This is an important historiographical point. Perhaps the most significant argument about the boycott movement in the last generation has been T.H. Breen's argument in Baubles of Britain and his later book, Marketplace of Revolutions, which points out that everyday colonists, men and women, even of different races and of different property levels, who might not be permitted by the various gender, racial, and property qualification rules for voting, who might not have been permitted to vote, could still voice their patriotism and their political preferences through non-consumption by boycotting tea and British goods. In Breen's reading, a boycott is a vehicle for regular colonists who are non-jurors to still participate in politics. This is a very alluring interpretation. And yet, the problem Boston patriots faced was rather different because the Tea Party wasn't a boycott. Colonists had chosen, and enough colonists might continue to choose to buy dutied tea. Enough colonists might choose to buy dutied tea as to amount to consenting toward parliamentary taxation, the very thing which colonists were supposedly unable to consent to, but which a movement of consumers, not who refused to consume, but a movement of consumers who chose to consume duty tea, could lead the colonies toward. In Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston, some colonists prevented other colonists from choosing freely for themselves by locking up, destroying, or sending back the East India Company's tea. Not a boycott, which some people might join and some people might not. This was a patriot edict functioning as law, because as what does law do? It binds all people, whether they support it or not, whether they voted for it or not. And it set up patriots as the main political voice and authority to speak for colonists against Parliament, whether you voted for those patriots or not, whether there was even a vote at all, as in the South Carolina case, there wasn't. But the boycott raises the question. This question of boycott raises a further question, which is whether colonial politicians or colonial merchants spoke for the public's desires. And the answer to this is much harder to determine. I'll circle back to it in a minute. Before going on, though, I want to point out one other issue. If the Boston Tea Party and the other furores in New York and Philadelphia and Charleston about tea in 1773, they were not simply about taxation representation, but about something a bit more complicated. They were also not simply about monopoly. For indeed, the idea of opposing the East India Company's tea on grounds that it was a monopolied good, while it sounds good at first glance, is a bit quizzical, because patriots often found that the alternative to English East India Company tea was tea smuggled in from the Netherlands. But this was no ideological alternative. Tea from the Netherlands was also imported by the Dutch East India Company, also a state chartered monopoly. It paid duty on its export from the Netherlands to North America, a low, small nominal duty, but a duty nonetheless, and the very sort of nominal duty which patriots seemed to oppose in the Tea Act. Finally, patriots had no more voice or vote in the Dutch legislature than they did in the British. So Dutch tea was, in many ways, the same as British tea, and of course, both paid tax on their export from China. No, the key about the Boston Tea Party was about politics. It was about Boston politics. It was about keeping Boston as a city on the revolutionary path, as its ability to maintain non-consumption of tea seemed to flag. For in 1770, as the non-importation and boycott movement of that year ended, it was supposed to be that North Americans would continue to non-importation and non-consumption of duty tea. All the other boycotts would end, but tea was supposed to remain boycotted. Well, New Yorkers and Philadelphians did boycott duty tea, as suggested by this chart, because they imported large amounts of tea from the Netherlands. But other colonists in Massachusetts, in the Chesapeake, in the Carolinas, in Quebec, chose to continue to import dutied and taxed tea in the years that followed. Boston patriots' political need to destroy the tea, lest it be consumed, and their failure to destroy that tea drove Boston politics in 1774. That tea remained outside the city on Castle Island. This is a map of Boston from the following year. You can see the entire settlement of Boston in the center left of the map. Castle Island is in the center right, a little bit down from the middle. The tea remained outside the city on Castle Island throughout the year, not offered for sale, but not returned to England either. It was an ever-present threat. If patriots let their guard down, if they let politics in the city cool, then the tea from the William could be landed potentially. This might reveal patriot weakness. It might show colonists wanted the tea. It might sap the willingness of patriots in other colonies to ban duty tea. A notable issue, since in early 1774, colonies like South Carolina and Virginia and Maryland hadn't brought in a ban on duty tea yet, or brought back in a ban on duty tea, while New York and Philadelphia did maintain one. The two most obvious modes of redress for the Boston Tea Party, criminal prosecution of individual Tea Partiers or a civil suit for damages, were especially dangerous to the Patriot movement. If either a criminal or civil case proceeded, it would weaken Patriot power in the streets, potentially long enough to allow for the tea to be landed. Governor Hutchinson and Massachusetts Attorney General Jonathan Sewell did seek to bring criminal charges, but failed. Patriots worked to keep the consignees away from town and the courthouse and pursued a thorough intimidation campaign, intimidating customs officials, judges, and potential witnesses from participating in any legal proceeding that might undo the Tea Party and allow the tea from the William to be landed. This is the true underlying reason for the brutal attack on John Malcolm, which is portrayed in this print from 1775. Malcolm was associated with the Customs House, and in January 1774, in Boston, he was beaten half to death and left outside in the cold so long, some thought he might die. After this, and you can see this is the first image to portray the Boston Tea Party, which you see occurring in the left background of this very image. And by February of 1774, patriots had made a political shift toward finding new reasons to be upset about old matters, the issue of judges' salaries and how they were paid, and particularly focusing on Chief Justice Peter Oliver. Again, I suspect, as a tool to intimidate the legal system. In early March, a series of near-daily events underscored Patriot street power in Boston. On Friday, March 4, John Hancock gave the annual Boston Massacre oration, whipping up the populace. on Sunday, March 6, a new vessel, the Fortune, arrived from London. It carried a privately shipped consignment of tea. Indians destroyed this cargo the next day. In the interval, some sort of negotiation seems to have taken place. I suspect customs officers tried to get her master to pull up to Castle Island, but the vessel, which was owned by Patriot merchants, even if it carried cargo for conservative men, pulled up to one of the wharves in town the next day, and the tea was destroyed mere hours later. I mentioned the issue of repeated games. Well, Patriots had destroyed 3 tea cargoes in December of 1774. In response, customs officers and government officials moved swiftly in December of 73, they destroyed the tea. Customs officers moved swiftly in January of 1774 to save the Williams cargo in response to the Boston Tea Party. In response to the quick saving in January of 74, when the next tea cargo arrives in March, both sides have to scramble in order to quickly either save or destroy it. This tea was destroyed mere hours after it reached the wharf. No wait of 20 days, no pretense that they were going to try to get it shipped back to England, no chance for it to be rescued. Bostonians couldn't afford this because, in fact, allowing this tea potentially to be landed or rescued would have potentially massive consequences. If the Fortune's tea were allowed to land, might not the Williams tea follow? The owners of the tea on the Fortune, as the consignees from the Dartmouth, Eleanor, and Beaver, were very silent about the matter. As Governor Hutchinson explained, quote, "I think if they could find out who were the immediate actors, they would not venture at present to bring any action in the law against them," unquote, lest the crowd chase them to Castle William too. That evening, after the tea had been destroyed, exhibits for the Boston Massacre Memorial were illuminated, showing the bodies and severed heads of Henry VII's tax collectors in a pool of blood, axe nearby, with portraits of Governor Hutchinson and Chief Justice Peter Oliver adjacent. Not a very subtle message. The mobs followed the Lieutenant Governor Andrew Oliver had died. His funeral came the next day. The mobs following the funeral train were so abusive that Chief Justice Oliver thought it unsafe to attend his brother's burial. None of the company's consignees had yet been able to return to Boston. When General Gage arrived in May of 74, he found Governor Hutchinson, Justice Oliver, customs commissioners, and the consignees either hiding in the castle or dispersed to the countryside. The radicals' philosophy, inter arma enim silent leges, in times of war, the law falls silent, had worked to prevent any legal action in response to the Boston Tea Party. Whereas in every other city, patriots had reached some sort of compromise with government officials, Boston's patriots had an unfinished riot, which left them unable to reach a similar compromise. Notably, it was New Yorkers who followed Philadelphia's example, not Boston's, in April of 74, when the Nancy finally arrived in that city with that city's cargo of East India Company tea. The Nancy is a strange story. It had been severely damaged in a storm, and it had to put in Antigua, of all places, for repairs. In the meantime, the East India Company had sent instructions to New York that this tea, if it met considerable opposition, should be redirected to a port where it could safely be landed, preferably Halifax, Nova Scotia. But Lieutenant Governor Colden decided instead to disregard this advice. It's unclear when or if it was received. And Lieutenant Governor Colden, the resident naval officer, customs officials, the New York consignees, the captain of the Nancy, all on the one hand, and the New York Sons of Liberty on the other, came to a mutually agreeable resolution to simply turn the ship around before it entered the New York customs area. It suited New York authorities and the consignees to avoid the trouble. It suited the Sons of Liberty to pursue a more restrained approach, since support of these other men helped guarantee success. In 1774, there was also considerable effort to pay for the tea destroyed in Boston Harbor the previous year. This often came from conservative Boston merchants or London merchants who traded with North America. But the Prime Minister, Lord North, and others needed the payment not to come from conservative merchants in Boston or merchants in London, but to come from official authorities, either the town of Boston or the colony of Massachusetts, because it was only such officially constituted bodies who could guarantee and enforce peaceable behavior amongst the populace. Else, patriots could just do it again. What a fun lark that would be to destroy more property and make rich conservatives pay for it. So the response to the Boston Tea Party was ultimately not paying for the tea, it was ultimately not a civil suit, it was ultimately not a criminal case. All these could have happened, but didn't. Instead, the Port Act was brought in Parliament. The Parliament's Port Act demanded payment for the East India Company's tea that had been destroyed in Boston Harbor. It also drove the issue of the Williams tea forward. Now, it's unclear whether the Port Act was intended to affect the matter of the Williams tea the way it did. North and Dartmouth were aware of that tea's survival, but at the time of the passage of the Port Act, Dartmouth was also considering repealing the Tea Act as well as a sort of olive branch, and there's no direct link drawn in North's or Dartmouth's letters or in the parliamentary debates around the Port Act explicitly connecting the Port Act to the surviving tea in the castle. One reason we've overlooked the story of the surviving tea until now. But clearly, paying for the tea Bostonians destroyed would facilitate selling the remaining tea. The Port Act also explicitly stipulated this, not explicitly, but clearly nonetheless. Reopening Boston required, according to the Port Act, quote, peace and obedience to the laws, unquote, such that, quote, the trade of Great Britain may safely be carried on there and His Majesty's customs duties duly collected, unquote. This meant that patriots would have to allow the Williams tea to be landed and taxed after Boston was reopened, and that future shipments of duty tea, such as on the Fortune, sent by private merchants, or sent by the company again, such as on the Dartmouth, Eleanor, and Beaver, would have to be allowed to be landed as a matter of course, were Boston's port to be allowed to stay open. And with the company's tea sorted and offered for sale in Boston, in South Carolina, customs collector Halliday could sell off the much larger supply of surviving company tea in the Charleston Exchange. These two sales, in turn, would have a good chance to kill off much of the opposition to company and or duty tea across the continent. Thus, it was accident. Who, like, was shot by the Port Act Boston, unified colonists around Boston, and it let colonists forget about their divisions about the Tea Party. Colonists soon donated to a common cause, the maintenance of Boston in its newly government enforced poverty, and the movement to pay for the tea died away. Without any fanfare or political state, colonists agreed to the shortages created as merchants cut back their imports of tea, expecting East India Company's tea to arrive. Tea prices remained high in early 1774, but gradually worked their way down throughout the year and into early 1775. Why and how do tea prices gradually go down? Well, one explanation, intuitively, is that people stopped buying tea because they were being good, patriotic colonists, and that certainly happened, and that's part of the explanation for why these prices go down. But the problem is it doesn't really work as a full explanation. There were shortages from 1773. There was new demand in 1774. And as the non-importation movement got going in 1774 and promised a boycott on all tea and British goods in 1775. The First Continental Congress and its Continental Association banned tea. Non-importation of tea was to be effective, of all kinds, was to be effective December 1, 1774, and non-consumption to be effective March 1st, 1775. And we see in the correspondence of merchants a common pattern, which is that people stocked up in 1774 in anticipation of the non-importation movement in 1775. Setting tea aside for a moment, it's instructive to notice simply regular legal importations from Britain, which were up roughly 30% in 1774 as people sought to increase their supplies in their larders and closets as they anticipated the boycott of 1775. If this happened with cloth and other cargoes, we can expect it happened with tea. The only way the demand of 1773 unmet, 1774 and 1775 could duly be met would be, even accounting for many people no longer consuming tea at all, if hundreds of thousands of pounds of new tea were imported into the Americas. This tea does not arrive and appear in customs ledgers because this tea would have been imported through smuggling and smuggled in from the Netherlands, landed most likely in Philadelphia and New York, and then redistributed around the colonies. Indeed, one of the crucial issues that patriots faced in Boston, in Worcester, in Philadelphia, and around North America in 1774 was that their early movements to ban tea had the potential, in a space of high prices, to be politically damaging. It could leave patriots in the position of looking like they were causing high prices and causing consumer harm. Being blamed for inflation and high prices then and now can be an important and damaging political issue. And so patriots would routinely both demand that colonists cease to consume tea and in the same breath fix the price of tea so that those colonists who did continue to consume tea could buy that tea at a fair price. I would suggest this was not a success. Their bans on tea were not as successful as they hoped. Well, a formal ban on tea did finally come in March 1, 1775. One emerging loophole in this, though, was the war. In particular, the issue of privateering, but more broadly, raiding in general. Here I show two images. In late 1775, Captain Manley, commanding the Lee, captured the Little Hannah and brought the vessel into Beverly, Massachusetts. The Little Hannah had brought provisions for the Royal Navy, and her capture was a celebrated triumph for Manley and for Washington's naval forces foraying out from Massachusetts into the sea. Amongst the cargoes taken from the Little Hannah was a barrel of tea. Captain Manley is portrayed here in a woodcut on the left. He was celebrated in print, song, and image after his naval triumphs. The Sucky, in from Cork, Ireland, was taken with beef, butter, potatoes, and, quote, 2 large canisters of tea, unquote. The image on the right is a painting of this vessel. Now the original is in the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Museum in New York. Tea, though banned, had a new logic whereby it might be consumed, the logic of capture. Colonists were taking and seizing all kinds of things from British officials, from British ships, from loyalists, from crown property. They took the cannons from Fort Ticonderoga and marched them across Massachusetts to besiege the British forces in Boston. Why not? If they are to do this, take the tea that Captain de la Place consumed in Fort Ticonderoga as well. And so tea soon found a new way to be used and consumed as colonists sought to consume British tea. And consuming British tea became a way not to flout the Congress's restrictions on consuming tea, but a way to thumb their noses at Parliament, to consume British tea, just like they were consuming the British potatoes and using the British guns and British ammunition was a way of weaponizing British resources against Britain. In this context, these India companies' own 2 cargoes of tea were sold and consumed by North American colonists. In 1775, the Williams cargo of tea was sold sold to loyalists then living in the city of Boston. Yes, they were loyalists, but we should not discount their tea drinking. They were loyal Massachusettsans who simply wanted to be let alone, to obey the law and drink their duty tea in peace, the very sort of actions the Tea Party was meant to prevent, and the precise thing they did in 1775. We've lost the story of the William, but in fact, we know the tea survived because I have discovered a note in the East India Company's records from that year describing a payment of slightly more than £1,000,000, slightly more than £1,000 sterling, paying the company for the tea auctioned off from the William and sold to Bostonians in that year. But the more striking story is not the Williams tea, but the Londons, which have been landed in South Carolina. After that tea was, after American independence on July 4th of 1776, Crown property became state property, or potentially a congressional property, but usually state property. And so the tea seized by customs collectors is in 1776 referred to as public teas, as indicated in this newspaper advertisement from South Carolina. And in 1776, the original 3 consignees, Roger Smith, Peter Legger, and William Greenwood, are tasked and added to by a reliable patriot, George Hall, to oversee the sale of this tea in order to raise revenue for the state. South Carolina, as many states, is facing a problem in this year. They have no money and no way to raise money without simply printing it. And so being able to sell off assets becomes a useful way to raise money by something other than money printing. And in doing so, the sale of the tea, the value of this money, the value of this tea ends up being roughly about enough to pay for the defense of Charleston in 1776. Notably, the consignees remained in the state and were allowed to handle this tea sale. Indeed, the fate of these consignees was very different from the story we assume from Boston, where almost all of the consignees fled. In South Carolina, Peter Legger remained in Charleston until his death in the 1780s. He'd made peace with the Patriots. Carolina consignee Roger Smith was even brought into the committees Patriots formed in Charleston in 74, probably to help keep an eye on his fellow consignees and to try to ensure they didn't secure the tea's release from the exchange. He went from serving on Patriot committees to taking up a post in the new state treasury. Despite rumors he was a ministerial agent, William Greenwood took an oath to the American cause and served in the rebel forces. He later also served in a loyalist militia during the British occupation of Charleston, and he fled when the British evacuated in 1782. But it was his military service, not his handling of the tea, that made him a loyalist. The stories of the William in Boston and the London in Charleston show us importantly that alternative outcomes for the tea shipped to North America were possible, that those outcomes actually happened, and that they were driven by choices of a panoply of people across the late colonial world. So, what was the real Boston Tea Party? It was a riot. It was incomplete. It was divisive. It was not at all the conclusive triumph we've imagined, and despite our assumptions to the contrary, it didn't really speak for what colonists wanted to consume. It did not make Americans dislike tea, for by 76, colonists drank tea in spite of the Tea Party, and Congress lifted its ban on tea, reasoning that everyone was drinking it, so there was no point keeping the ban in place. Americans in 1800 drank as much tea as their parents had in 1770, but the Boston Tea Party occasioned no great American shift away from tea. It was the partial destruction and partial survival of the company's tea that is the real story of the Boston Tea Party, the way this incomplete revolution drove Boston politics forward in the months ahead, and the continued desire to consume, to live the good life amidst a world that too often left colonists dark, cold, and weary, that made it so hard for any boycott to succeed. I'll stop there and ask if there are any questions.
Thank you very much, James. If there are questions, you can raise your hand and unmute yourself and ask. So if I can ask James, you are pointing out that the colonists, some use this for propaganda value, that is wanting to see this in a certain way. So are you downplaying the significance of this event? And we know that a revolution does happen, that the United States become independent. So are you saying that this wasn't as big a deal as we've been led to believe?
Not quite. That's a great question because the revolution does happen. And so one answer could be the revolution happens in spite of the Tea Party. Actually, though, I would phrase it a little differently. The revolution happens in different stages. The revolution in Boston happens earlier and is more aggressive than elsewhere. It's much more fully developed by early 74 on the ground in terms of street, crowd, action. It's not happening at the same level in other places. What makes the revolution distinctive in Boston isn't so much the destruction of the tea in Boston Harbor, but the partial destruction of the tea in Boston Harbor. It locks patriots into this position where they must defend what they've done before the destruction of the tea at a time when many oppose it, but also not allow more tea to be landed, lest it undermine their movement. So actually, because the Tea Party is incomplete, it leaves the Boston Patriots' position uniquely fragile, and therefore they respond by being even more radical and revolutionary in result. So tea matters, and the Boston Tea Party matters, but it matters not because they destroyed all the tea, but because they destroyed only some of it.
If no one else has a question, I have another one. You showed that wonderful table showing the non-importation movement, and Bostonians had not complied with it as much as the
No.
others. And we know that when the news of the tea was coming, Philadelphia merchants sent the circular to the other colonies. So do you think part of this was that Boston just did not want to be embarrassed again by not complying with the non-importation, that Bostonians were often foremost in advocating for others?
Yes, I mean, I think that's so. Not only would it have embarrassed Boston, but this is a moment. This is before Continental Congress is created and formed. And so once there's a Congress, Congress becomes initially the sole central organ that combines different colonies together. Later, there will be an army and other institutions. But before Congress, the institutional apparatus that linked the movement or coordinated the movement was really the Boston Committee of Correspondence. It corresponded to New York, to Philadelphia, to Charleston, to the individual Massachusetts towns or even New England towns and other colonies directly. And there was a lot less correspondence between the different colonies. You'll recall in a lot of descriptions of the First Continental Congress, we will often read that it is the first time that Congressman X will meet people from this other colony or even travel to such another colony, and therefore people are meeting each other for the first time. Before that, Boston is a central node, and so for Boston to lose face in such a way would be especially damaging. Whereas later, if Boston loses face, it doesn't matter because there's Congress that's the greater force. And in any case, by the time of the Port Act, Boston has simply been recast in the role of victim.
Any other questions from our viewing audience? If I could just ask one more then, what is it like teaching this in Hong Kong? I mean, the tea does come from ships from Guangzhou, and now and in the 1780s, we know ships from Boston and New York are arriving there to get by tea. So what's it like when you're teaching this subject to students in Hong Kong?
Oh, that's a great question. I had a wonderful opportunity to speak in Massachusetts, in South Carolina, in a variety of U.S. venues last month about this, and with you today. And I've had few opportunities to speak about this to non-US audiences. And that's really the key, Cleve, because the Boston Tea Party is a canonical textbook, schoolboys, schoolgirls know it kind of a story if you're an American. I don't think it's in Canadian textbooks or Mexican textbooks the same way. It's not in British textbooks the same way. There's no assumption of Johnny Tremaine going on there. And it's certainly not in Hong Kong or Chinese or British textbooks. And so in speaking about it to non-American audiences, I have to, while the talk I give to you is about, in many ways, debunking or disagreeing with what we think we know, if I'm speaking about it elsewhere, people have never heard of it at all if they've heard anything of the American Revolution, which is not well discussed overseas, certainly not anywhere that the British ever had a colony did the American Revolution get talked about very much. The first talk I gave about this was in Taiwan, and the background knowledge there was complete zero about most American history, let alone this part of the American Revolution. So it's a very different experience. I don't need to be saying what you think you know about the Tea Party is wrong. Instead, I need to explain anything about what's going on in the revolution at all. There was this dispute about taxation. I have to almost, in some ways, recreate that primary textbook knowledge, but try to rewrite it in a way that I'm not going to disagree with, because then I'm just fighting with myself. I have several events where I'm looking to speak to Hong Kong audiences about this in the next couple of weeks. And so that's exactly kind of the issue that I'm struggling with, in part because it's also funny. If you're Chinese, tea is not an American story. It's a Chinese one.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Fichter. And there is a link here for those who want to purchase the book, Tea, Consumption, Politics, and Revolution, 1773 to 1776. A great book, and I look forward to talking to you again. So thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to all for participating this evening.
Well, thank you very much, Bob. It's a pleasure and an honor to be with you.
Well, that was fun. Thanks for taking the time to do this.
Oh, thank you. It was a joy.